I also, yeah, I don't think I fall neatly into anything. So I just avoid all that stuff to begin with. And race is another one of those things. I don't see myself as any racial category. I actively reject those things because I think they box people in, and some people really like that box, but I don't.
So thank you so much for joining me on the podcast, Angel Eduardo. I'm so looking forward to speaking to you.
Thank you. It's been a long time coming. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, so we were just saying actually before we started recording, that there's so many people that over the last few years, we've all connected, and I think a lot of it obviously happened with the Black Lives Matter moment in 2020, and it
Yeah.
does feel very, I think a lot of things have changed, but I think since then. But one of the good things I think that actually did emerge from it, and that's a whole other conversation in itself. But I think one of the interesting things that did emerge was the amount of interesting voices and interesting people that otherwise may have been vaguely aware of each other or not aware of each other at all.
Mm.
And connected in new ways. So I think that this is one of those examples. So it's really great that we've finally been able to actually do something.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. For sure.
okay,
We.
yeah. So, I mean, the first thing that would be really helpful to for the people listening to this podcast and watching was just a little bit of background about yourself. How did you become involved in the discussion around freedom of expression,
Mm.
tolerance, nuance, discussions about race? I mean, tell us a little bit about the journey and the background to where
Mm.
how this all happened.
Well, I think the short answer is compulsion. Uh, I'm an artist. I play music. I write. I do all kinds of art, and I guess fundamental to that art is this desire to communicate, this desire to absorb and reflect and report and give my perspective as if someone wants it. um, that's just kind of how I'm wired, and particularly in 2020 when things got very crazy and people were cooped up in their houses and it became much more of an online thing. So all the craziness ends up online, and you're sitting at home, and you can't help but watch it. It's the only thing to watch. I started feeling more and more like I should say something. And yeah, like I said, I've been a writer. I've always wanted to do that sort of thing, and I've always aspired to contribute to that intellectual conversation, this cultural conversation, because I admire so many people like yourself and John McWhorter and Glenn Lowry and all these people that I'm sure you and your audience know. And yeah, the Harper's letter came out in 2020, right? And that was with Thomas Chatterton Williams and a few people signed, just kind of making a very anodyne statement about free expression and open dialogue. And the response to it was so crazy to me that there was something that clicked in my head. And I thought, I have a lot to say about a lot of these things, but this one seems particularly egregious in this moment because people are reading it so wrong. And so I wrote this piece for Areo Magazine called I'm a Nobody, and the Harper's letter was for me. And the point was just to say that, all these big people like J.K. Rowling and Salman Rushdie are taking the hit and saying this and trying to establish, our culture of open dialogue because they can handle the blowback that inevitably they got. Whereas if I were to speak some heresies, like maybe Black Lives Matter doesn't have it all right, or maybe abolishing the police is a bad idea. Things like that. I didn't feel as comfortable because I didn't feel I was as protected. I was really worried actually, even in writing that piece, that something might happen. I had a great job, and I was concerned that someone might try to, end that for me. Thankfully, that didn't happen. What ended up happening is the opposite, actually. More people started asking me to write more things, and here I am. I ended up working with a bunch of organizations and talking to great people like yourself, and yeah, here I am, just continuing to do it.
No, that's a really interesting journey, and I think actually it's probably quite similar for a lot of people
Hmm.
that that there that there was concerns about the way that the direction of travel of the discussion, and
Hmm.
many people, in many ways, myself also felt a kind of moral obligation to
Yeah.
say something and say, actually, well, I've got a different experience with a slightly different take. And because it was such a heated and concentrated moment, as you said, 2020, lockdown, all of these kinds of things, I think that there was kind of pressure cooker conditions,
That's
which,
right. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, which sprung so many different opportunities that perhaps may not have happened under the same circumstances. But
Right.
let's get into the article that you wrote, because I think it is very interesting, this idea, and I think I very much agree with you that when we talk about censorious cultures in different institutions,
Hmm.
or different censorious atmospheres around talking about different discussions. Well, a lot of people will say, "Oh, well, how can you talk about this? You've got lots of platforms. You've got a big voice.
Right.
How this is not really valid. It doesn't really
Hmm.
exist." Well, actually, as you rightfully mentioned, that is often the people that have the voices that are at least trying to raise awareness for people that don't necessarily have the same opportunities. And
Hmm.
so you said that you come from a creative and artistic and musical background. I mean, what would you say about that world? I mean, I think it's I often that there's often discussion that many people in the creative industries, or the general culture within the creative industries, um, isn't today as open to challenge and discussion and debate and
Mm.
individual eccentricity in the same way that perhaps you might usually associate with the creative sectors. What
Yeah.
what do you think?
I think a lot of it is, well, it's kind of like the news, right? If you just watch the news, you'll get a really ugly and distorted view of what the world is like. It's probably similar to that because I think there are still pockets of the artistic community that are really engaged, and there's always going to be that push and pull of tell a comedian that they can't say certain things, and that's all they're going to want to say, and that's all they're going to say, and they're going to defy that convention. And that's always been true, and there's always been the fight between more conservative people or people who think you cannot or should not say or do certain things, and the artists who insist on doing it. So I don't want to paint too bleak of a picture there, but I think that there's also a sense in which people assume that artists are freer from cliquishness and conformity than they actually are. It's still humans and it's still high school in a sense. And people want to be liked and they want to be accepted, and there are norms and there are cliques, and people will say and do whatever they got to say and do to get into certain groups and into certain spheres of influence and things like that. That's just as true for artists and the artistic community, I guess, or the business, the artistic business, right? The whole Hollywood thing. You want to get invited to the parties, you want to get into people's offices, and you have to kind of play ball, and that's kind of what people do. I feel like it's the same, but it sticks out more because artists are supposed to be transgressive. They're supposed to be independent and free spirited and all that kind of stuff, and they are. And I try to be, but they're still people, and those that gravitational pull of conformity and wanting to be liked is still there, and a lot of people succumb to it. So
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. I
mm,
think that there's obviously the general sense that artists push boundaries and are creative, but they're of course still subject to the same forces and uh, you know all the types of things that everybody else is.
yeah,
So I think
yeah,
that's very true. I mean, so what you're one of the things that it seems from the outside, is that you're very interested in this whole idea of nuance and like,
mm,
balance and different sides of the debate. I mean, how do you navigate that? Because I think, I mean, obviously things have moved on since 2020, but I think
mm,
there is definitely a pressure to, stick your nail very hard and punchy in
yeah,
one direction.
yeah,
And in some senses, I definitely think there can be a role for that. In some spaces, you do need that debate in a much more binary way. But
mm,
obviously, everything moving society forward is of course based off of compromises and trade-offs and
mm-hmm.
and understanding the other side. So how do you navigate that so well?
Well, I don't know how well I do it, but I try, and I think to put it in a funny way, I'm used to not having a lot of friends. So I kind of, always had trouble fitting in, and I there was a period of my life where I tried very, very hard to do whatever I had to do, change whatever I had to change about myself, to behave the right way and say the right things and listen to the right music and wear the right clothes so that I fit in with, this or that group. And it never worked. I was never good enough at it to successfully assimilate. And so eventually I gave up and I just kind of said, well, okay, I'm going to have to just be whatever this is. And I guess that prepared me a little bit more for this sort of thing. But also, it's a temperamental thing, I'm sure, where there's always this thing in the back of my head saying, like, yeah, but there's also this. And I can't really ignore it. I guess other people are better at that, or they're better at hiding the fact that that dissonance is happening. But I have no problem saying, but on the other hand, and people get really upset
You're
with
a
me about that too.
contrarian,
Yeah, uh,
basically.
people get upset with me about that a lot because it kind of, at least to them, they interpret it as me not wanting to take a firm stance on anything. But what I'm really trying to do is acknowledge the difficulty and the nuance. It's not, you know, there are no easy answers to anything. So I'm trying to do that. It comes off to some people as if I'm trying to be everything to everyone. I've gotten that before. I don't think that's true at all. I have very, very strong convictions and I feel very strongly about specific ideas. I do take stances on things, but especially in public, my focus is more about the conversation around those things than my personal beliefs about those things, right? Like I'll vote or I'll write an essay and I'll express my specific opinion on an issue that way. But when it comes to engagement, I'm more interested in getting people to see one another's perspectives so that maybe we can move forward from the boring part of just, it's A versus B and they just clash and clash and clash and it never gets anywhere.
How much do you think that has moved on now since perhaps a more A versus B discussion that I think was perhaps
Mm,
happening a lot more in 2020? Do you feel that the conversation has moved forward? Do you feel that
yeah.
there's a lot more people willing to have to cross those what would ostensibly be quite difficult or opposing political
Yeah.
divides?
Well, possibly. I think probably what's true now has been true and was still true in 2020, which is just that there's the silent majority of people who are reasonable and understand that things are not easy and that they're very complicated. And then there's that tiny percentage up top that's extremely loud and extremely polarized. And they take up all the bandwidth and all the space and all the energy of everybody else. And, most people are just getting up and going to work and having conversations amongst themselves in their communities and probably disagreeing and maybe getting heated and maybe getting angry, but it's not as fever pitched as we seem to think it is. So I feel like that was there before and it's still there now, because you still have people who are there are also incentives. People are incentivized to be as dramatic and as acerbic as possible, and that's a problem. But it's also an illusion. We shouldn't overestimate not just their influence, but also how many of those people there actually are. And people like to log on to their video game, their social media video game, and kind of do that. But then they log off, and there's something else going on in the real world. So we should keep ourselves aware of that so that we avoid falling into these traps. But also the topic shifts. So I think there's been a lot of movement in terms of something like Black Lives Matter, something like defund the police. Right, we've seen enough has happened. Right, enough terrible things have happened, and enough good things have happened where that conversation is necessarily more nuanced because we can't really deny the things that are in front of us. But the conversation just kind of shifts to something else. Instead of race as much, it's more about gender stuff and all that kind of stuff. And the same mistakes are being made there, I think, in terms of the discourse. But yeah,
Yeah, very much in the UK. It's a
I bet.
very
I bet.
polarized discussion in the UK, to say the least. Okay, so then what? So you've been involved in various different organisations.
Hmm.
So Centre for Inquiry, and then FAIR, and you're with uh, Fire now, right?
Yeah, I'm a senior
Yeah,
writer and editor for Fire.
uh, fantastic. I mean, so what do you think about the role of organizations, and institutions, and
hmm
creating new institutions really to
hmm
uphold certain ideals? What do you make of that, and how successful do you think those um, that particular strategy from a wider societal perspective has been? Because there has been a lot of idea, institutions are being captured, and we need to create our own new
Yeah,
institutions. And what do you think
yeah.
about that?
I think it's very, very hard to build things,
Mm.
especially if you are building things to be kind of a negative image of something else. You're it's not the right thing. I think our mutual friend Camille Foster says, you need to be for something. And if you're going to be for something, if you're going to build an institution like a university or something like that, and you're going to affirm certain principles and say, this is what we're for, well, those institutions already exist. If they've been captured, quote unquote, then maybe recapture them, or maybe don't overemphasize the capture part. There are good bones there, as they say, with flipping houses and things. They're good bones, and maybe you just need to figure out the best way to get back in there and to take it back, quote unquote. I mean, there's a lot of that language that is also just we're incentivized to do it because it creates a narrative that helps with certain political campaigns and things like that. But creating new institutions is great. I think I think that there's a place for organizations like Fire, like Fair, because it. I think a lot of people feel unmoored and they feel alone in their thoughts and their principles and their ideas. They're looking at things happening around them and saying, "This is crazy. Am I crazy? Am I the only person who thinks this?" And then an organization pops up and says, "No, here are a bunch of people who think this, and not only do they think it, but we've organized around these principles to do something about it." I think that's good. That's a heartening thing. And it's a way for the response to be less reactive and more responsive, if that makes any sense. There's a way in which we can utilize the structures of institutions to have more of an impact rather than a bunch of people yelling at another bunch of people who are yelling back. That's the utility I see. And also, it's helpful to have a kind of environment that's fostered by these organizations where you don't just feel like you're not alone, but you also feel like something can be done and here's a structured way to do it you know
No, I agree. I definitely agree. I mean, so where do you stand? Like, I mean, do you would you describe yourself as political? Like, would you say that I'm a this, I'm a that, or and
mm.
if yes, in what way? And if not, I mean, do you have particular guiding principles that you would say always you always go back to when it comes to where you're gonna what position you're gonna take?
um no, I think that's one of the reasons that I annoy people so much is I you know I kind of I well, I don't fit very neatly into any label. I've
Mm.
noticed and I've tried. Um, and so now I just kind of do the Groucho Marx thing of I would never be a part of any club that would have me as a member. So if you gave me a test, and like a political test of my political leanings or something, I've taken a few of those. I always end up somewhere, left on the political left of things, but I don't identify myself that way. I don't see any utility in labeling myself that way, especially because it creates so much extra work I have to do to disabuse people of certain assumptions they make the minute that they hear that label. Some people are fine with that. Some people, maybe those assumptions are correct or they feel that they're correct or acceptable. But to me, it's like, no, now you're going to think XYZ. And I have to now break that down and say, no, no, no. I do think ABC, but not XYZ. And it's just easier to say, well, if people ask me, what are you? I just say, well, ask me a question, like ask me something specific and I'll tell you. Like, are you for gun reform? Yes. Are you for universal basic income? Yeah. I think that's an idea we should definitely at least talk about, but uh, I also, yeah, I don't think I fall neatly into anything. So I just avoid all that stuff to begin with. And race is another one of those things. I don't see myself as any racial category. I actively reject those things because I think they box people in, and some people really like that box, but I don't. So
Would you say there's certain things? Because obviously, I think there are connections in the types of things that you've said and the kinds of
mhm.
places that you've said them.
Mhm.
So, would you say that there are certain principles that you would say underlie your beliefs?
Yeah, I believe that. Yeah, well, I mean, I think that when you drill down to that, I think I my principles are pretty much the same as everybody else's. I believe in fairness. I believe in love. I believe in freedom. I believe in compassion. I believe that open communication is the only way to resolve our issues, right? There's the Sam Harris thing of we're on a continuum between conversations and violence, and I want to stay as far away from violence as possible. Uh, and that's why I think words are not violence. I think they're the exact opposite. So, if you drill down into specifics, then yeah, you'll get more specific convictions from me, but on the principles that I have are those human principles that I think most people would agree. Yeah, I believe in those things. How they inform you, later on in those, when you go up a few levels, how they inform your political or social opinions, that changes depending on people's temperaments and psychology and all kinds of stuff. But yeah, those are my main principles, I would say.
Interesting. So, I mean, so tell us a bit about your background because it was interesting then that you said that you not only, you push back against the notion of race, if not reject it.
Hmm.
And why do you think that is? And what led you to that conclusion?
It's another one of those things where I didn't fit neatly into the stereotype, the positive or the negative stereotypes of any
Mm.
particular group. Also, I guess my parents are from the Dominican Republic. I was born in the United States, but I guess it depends on who you ask too. But we're kind of Schrodinger's person of color. Like people say, "No, you're black," or they say, "No, you're a separate thing." Or, I mean, I've been called white a lot for saying the wrong things. Um, so I just kind of realized that these categories are really unhelpful and arbitrary, and I find no use in them at all. I mean, what use do I get out of looking at you and making that assumption, just saying because of your highly melanated status, you are part of this larger cohort? What does that do? It doesn't really inform me in any kind of way. I don't know anything about you or your background or anything like that. So I just realized slowly as I grew up, like this stuff is kind of useless, so I don't care. and and when it reached that fever pitch in 2020 in particular, um, I actively railed against it because I just saw all the ways that it was creating problems. So
So, would you say that you support the colorblind principle? Because obviously that is a big debate
yeah.
within
Hmm.
America,
Hmm.
and again in the UK very much so in a slightly different way. But
Yeah.
would you say that you would advocate for that?
I would say yes and so so yes, I certainly agree with the Martin Luther King thing of judging by the character and not the color of the skin. But I would actually dream a little bit bigger than that and say it's not enough to be colorblind because there's a notion in there that we see race, but we don't let it influence our judgment of people. And my thing is there is no race. That's all nonsense, and we need to just disabuse ourselves completely of that notion. So I'm kind of a race atheist. I really want us to all just reject that stuff. Of course, we're going to see one another's skin color, but we see one another's hair color all the time and our eye color all the time, and it means nothing. That's where we should get to. We shouldn't be acknowledging these categories at all in any kind of substantial way.
Yeah, no, I think yeah, because I know that there are several thinkers that do share that conviction.
Hmm.
Thomas Hassan Williams, as we spoke about earlier, and Camille Foster, and
Hmm.
Sheena Mason, I think her name is.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think so. What do you say to those who say, well, it's not really something that we can do as individuals. Like you couldn't individually opt out of
Mm.
racial discrimination, so to speak. That in a sense,
Right.
it's one of those things that ends up being somewhat rhetorical rather than actually, in order to do that would require, a social transformation. Do you agree with that, or not?
No, in a sense, yeah. Of course, I can't abolish race by myself, but that's why
Mm,
we have these conversations. That's why I voice these opinions and ideas and go back and forth with people, and then maybe that persuades somebody else, and now there's two of us, and that's how it works, and I'm fine with that. And yes, of course, there's a distinction between the concept of race and racism itself, right? The same way that I also happen to just be an atheist in general. But it doesn't mean I don't believe that religion exists or that Christians exist, right? I know they do. And I know that their beliefs impact the world around me. And I'm going to be
mm,
affected by that. And history has been affected by that. None of that goes away. I'm not pretending all that stuff vanishes. What I'm saying is I'm not playing ball with these ideas. I'm not going to further them myself. I'm not going to internalize them myself. Thomas Chatterton Williams talks about being mistaken for Arab because he lives in Europe. And I get that all the time. I've had people come up to me speaking Arabic. I've had people come up to me speaking Greek, and I'm not Greek and I'm not Arab, right? So the argument sort of implies the argument people make against this position seems to imply that because someone might walk up to me speaking Arabic, I may as well learn Arabic and start responding in Arabic. But that's ridiculous. I'm not Arab. Like it's great to learn Arabic, but it's not going to make me Arab. And it's it's just an understanding that something is going on. There's a dynamic that's happening that's a result of certain things, certain beliefs, and certain ideas. But I don't have to adhere to them. I don't have to adopt them myself.
yeah, I think it's interesting because I think over the last few years there's been different divides that have emerged in the discussion. So there's always been, and circling back to the beginning when you mentioned the Harper's letter, there's
Mm-hmm.
always been that kind of liberal, which I would say the Equiano project is mostly aligned with. But there's been this like liberal, we need open discussion, we need dialogue, we need more nuanced conversations, we need to hear different
Mm-hmm.
views, and then you have like perhaps the more populist conservative approach, which you see in people like Christopher Rufo, who have been very controversial
Yeah.
in America, but in other ways have also been quite successful insofar as they have raised the political salience of certain issues in a way that
Mm-hmm.
perhaps was not done in the same way by liberals, like
Mm-hmm.
myself or people that were writing the Harper's letter.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you say to those who say that actually it's all well and good having nice conversations and doing podcasts and let's all have that, but what we need is punchy, like fiery political conflict in
Mm-hmm.
order to actually push forward a particular ideology, and,
Right.
and that you in a way that it's not, it's all well and good essentially having liberal
Yeah.
conversations, but they don't
Mm-hmm.
actually make the political difference.
Yeah. I think it's a there's a myopia there. And unfortunately, I think it's the oldest thing in the world. It's no, we don't have time for this. You
Mm,
need to just do this by force.
mm,
Well, what I would say to these people is, okay, well, flip it and imagine your opponents are doing what you're intending to do, and they're doing it to you, and they're doing it by force. Are they changing your mind? Are they going to stop you from responding? Or are you now in the submissive position and all you're thinking about is how am I going to retaliate? How am I going to get back on top? And what does that do? That just keeps us on this endless cycle of people going back and forth, tit for tat, and we never actually get anywhere. The conversation stuff is less sexy. It's less. It doesn't satisfy those kind of urges that we have, those very human urges that we have to defeat the enemy and destroy evil and all that kind of stuff. But it's the only thing that actually works. Slow, progressive change works through persuasion and engagement. And that's the only real way forward. You can have your Pyrrhic victory now, but all you're doing is setting, any power you grant yourself and any action you allow yourself, you're granting and allowing for your opponent. So whatever you do, if you're going to silence people's speech, if you're going to impose your ideological perspective, any of those things, you're basically saying these are fair game. And when it's your turn, you get to do it to us. And I mean, that gets us nowhere. I don't see any positive end to that. It's just going to keep going around and around in circles. I think the better way is the longer way, the more difficult way. Things that are worthwhile tend to take longer to do, and they tend to take more effort, and they tend to be the grunt work that nobody finds glamorous. But it's the only real way that I know that any progress has actually happened.
And why do you think that people have lost faith in certain liberal ideals? Because we touched upon Martin Luther King very briefly, but a lot of the time people actually, increasingly, I think actually his legacy is being discussed and debated, and I mean it has always been, but I think we see that again now. I mean, I can't remember who that he was talking to, but I listened to, I think it was an IQ squared or intelligence squared or podcast with Coleman, with somebody that from the New York Times that had a very different view. And the gentleman from the New York Times was, even suggesting that actually Martin Luther King and say what wasn't actually colorblind, didn't advocate that kind of politics, and loads of people that have it's broadly been accepted that they advocated certain politics. He was insisting that wasn't actually their politics. And so, how do you? Yeah, why do you think that people like Martin Luther King, who were, really hugely responsible, and other people in his time for advocating that content of your character type of politics, but that no longer has the same confidence or moral authority within certain prominent anti-racist circles?
Mm.
Why do you think it no longer is the dominant view in these
Yeah.
circles?
There's something that I see a lot, which is, people tell me, "Hey, did you know Da Vinci was a vegetarian?" I'm like, what does that have to do with anything? But it matters to these people because they're vegetarian.
Mm.
And there's a sense in which Martin Luther King and people like that are used as political footballs. They're used as kind of avatars for things. And, Martin Luther King was a very complicated person. He had very complicated thoughts and nuanced thoughts on things. And you can find ways to justify your right-wing perspective with Martin Luther King, and you can find ways to justify your left-wing perspective with Martin Luther King. He was extremely radical about certain things, but also extremely conservative about other things. And people just kind of pick and choose, and the reason they're picking and choosing is because they already have their own perspective. They're just looking for support. So to the extent that anything that MLK said that doesn't jibe with, the current anti-racist movement or the current anti-racist moment, they're just going to ignore that stuff, or they're going to find some way to argue around it, right? And the same thing on the right. The right is going to say, no, content of our character, while ignoring certain very important things that Martin Luther King emphasized as being necessary for that end to be achieved, right? So it's just these people, they're not people anymore. They're symbols for things. And they're images that you put on flags and posters, and they become rallying cries, and they're not full nuanced people anymore.
Yeah, and I think that's very true, and I think
Mm.
I think it can be frustrating, as you said, because actually, I think there's a lot of nuance in many of these important historical figures' views.
Right.
Actually, and let's have
Yeah.
and that's part of why they were great figures and really transformative and important during their time.
Mm-hmm.
So, where do you stand on the discussion about American history? There was the whole 1619 project, and
Right.
the Counter 1776 project.
Mm-hmm.
And that this sense that America has been, people are trying to say that American history is essentially evil, like
Right.
racism is the essential defining characteristic of American history. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
what do you think? I mean, how do you what view do you take on how we should understand America, the past?
I think we should understand it as being as messy as it actually was. I'm
Mm,
very inspired by Frederick Douglass, and
mm,
if you read one example of what we're talking about is his "What to a Slave is the Fourth of July" speech, right?
Mm-hmm.
People love that speech. People on both ends of the spectrum love that speech, and they love to share that speech, but they only share pieces of that speech, right? So people on the right, or people who are more pro-America, quote unquote, will quote, the beginning where he lavishes praise on the founding fathers and talks about how wonderful the Constitution is and all that kind of stuff, and ignore what follows, which is a very vicious tirade against the hypocrisy of America for continuing slavery and having the institution of slavery despite those principles. And on the other end, you have the flip side of that. You have people who skip all that stuff in the beginning and skip all that stuff at the end, where Frederick Douglass says that he's hopeful and that he believes in America and he believes in the principles. And all he wants is for those principles to be applied consistently. They ignore those parts and focus only on the tirade in the middle. And that's just what people do. But I think it's so much more interesting to look at people like, the founding fathers and all their complexity. And, I went to the, in Washington, D.C., the Museum of African American History. And there's early drafts of the Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson. You can see the drafts where slavery was included, and he addressed it. And they were working this stuff out. And obviously, they reached the wrong conclusion of just kind of kicking the ball down the road and waiting, hopefully for someone else to solve it. But you can see that they were grappling with this stuff, and that obviously the contradiction between their stated principles and the actions, it was something that was front of mind for them. And I think that's so much more interesting, and it's way better for us to engage with that than to come up with mythic narratives about how wonderful they were and we should put them high up on this pedestal, or how awful they were and how purely evil everything is. I mean, both of those are skewed perspectives. I think the reality is messy. Reality is complicated, and it's okay for that to be the case. It's okay for, speaking of Martin Luther King, I mean, one thing that I talk about all the time with people is that, the first thing that happened when Martin Luther King Jr. was shot in Memphis was his assistant ran up to him and took the cigarettes out of his pocket. And then he told his girlfriend to go home, Martin Luther King's girlfriend to go home, because she was there with him. Coretta was not there. And a lot of people just don't know about that, right? And none of that takes away from the man's legacy and all the wonderful things that he said and did, and then the effect of those things. But that's a reality, right? You can read a newspaper column that he had where someone wrote in about their cheating husband. And, he was doing what would be characterized today as blaming the victim. He would say, he said things to the effect of, it's been a while since I read it, but things to the effect of like, well, are you dressing the right way? Are you fulfilling his needs, etc. Right? And this is Martin Luther King Jr., the wonderful, all-hailed man, right? It's complicated. People are complicated. Things are complicated. And that's okay. That doesn't take away from any of the good. I think we need to learn more to engage with that and stop playing around with these myth-making endeavors in either direction, you know?
Well, on that note, thank you so much, Angel, for joining me on the podcast. I think there's lots of really important things I think listeners are going to take away.
Mm,
Appreciate complexity,
yeah.
and actually, we and stop essentially weaponizing people for political ends, because
Hmm.
actually you erase their greatness and their and on what was so interesting and transformative about them.
Indeed. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. In many ways,
Thank you so
it's
much.
those in many ways it's those flaws that make the wonderful things, the wonderful heights, moral and ethical heights that these people have reached, that much more impressive. If they were just perfect, well, of course they're perfect, and of course they're doing everything wonderful. Like, they're human beings and they're complicated and flawed, and that's what matters.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Where can our listeners find you?
Well, I'm on X, Twitter. I'm at. I'm
You're
on.
actually
Yeah.
saying X. I'm pretty impressed about that, to be honest.
No, I only set it to set up the joke about dead naming it
Oh,
as Twitter. I still call it Twitter.
X, formerly known as Twitter. That's what I
Right.
see all the
Yeah.
time
Yeah. The platform formerly known as Twitter. I'm at Strangel Ed Weird on there. And I have a website, angeleduardo.com, where I keep pretty updated on everything I've got, including podcasts and things. So feel free to visit me there. And yeah, it was wonderful to talk to you, Anaya. And I'm glad it's a long time coming. It's been 3 years since I've known of you, and it's wonderful to get to chat.
Thank you.